Hello everyone and welcome to another Onshape tutorial. Today we're going to be designing the beginnings of a surfboard. By the end of this tutorial series, you'll have your own surfboard that you've designed in Onshape from scratch. So we're just going to get right into it today. We're going to start with an empty part studio, and as with many other types of industrial design that we might be doing, the first thing that you might want to consider is actually finding some sort of reference image that will help you create your surfboard. We'll actually provide the reference to this image and the brand as well as the imagery itself in the comments or in the description of this video, so that you can take it and actually do the same type of design that we're doing here. Now, one thing to keep in mind as we start approaching this design is that we probably are going to want to use symmetry down the line. So it would be a good idea to try and line up the picture that we're going to be using with the center of the image. So I'm getting pretty close here. Definitely faster ways of doing this if you are using an image that it's a little bit better defined. So there we go. That's a right around half. I don't need it to be perfect. Another thing that I probably want to do is create some sort of midpoint reference that I can then use on my image. And then I'm just going to create a constraint between the origin point and my image. And that's going to be the first piece of reference imagery that I'm going to create. Something to keep in mind as you create these reference images is that you do not want to sketch on top of them. That really can come back to bite you if you sketch on top of the reference image. That's just not gonna be fun if you end up not liking the design that you put together, and then you basically will have to delete everything. So I highly recommend that you figure out your reference image in one sketch, and then you're actually imaging another. I am doing this live, so it's always, you got to split your brain into, as we do this work. What I'm doing here is defining everything and just kind of creating some constraints for myself that will help me later down the line to just reference this and kind of have a sense of what I want the board to look like. So I'm just going to eyeball this 37 and a half. That looks fine. This does not need to be perfect. Just for anyone that is following along, I am working on centimeters today. So everything that you see here is going to be centimeters. Because we want to give you the freedom to customize your own surfboard and really make this your own, I'm not going to fully define this, rather give you the tools to do it alongside what I'm doing, and just start doing the same design. Just, it's going to be your own. So I'm going to start with a sketch now that I've got my reference images in place, and I'm going to use a Bezier spline. Bezier splines are very nice because they give me very clean curves, and that's going to be very handy later down the line. And I'm going to create something that looks like this. So the benefit of using a Bezier over a regular spline is that, as you can see, my curve is continuous. So if I analyze the curvature here, you can see that there is just full continuity on that entire spline. And you can see that obviously as my continuity gets more drastic, or the changes get a little bit more accentuated, well, that is reflected in the curve. By not having as many control points, I'm going to give myself a much better curve to work out of, and that is going to pay dividends for me down the line, just because the quality of my overall surface is going to be better. Something else that you'll notice is that I'm not tracing the exterior of the board completely. I'm actually keeping a little bit of the interior. That ledge there, that's something that I'm going to have to create later. So I want to give myself some space. Again, this does not need to be an exact science. You can really build the board however you want. You can add fins to it. You can do whatever you feel is right. And then we're going to mirror that. And it's best when we're surfacing to use symmetry as much as possible. That is going to make our life very much easier down the line. So whenever you can find yourself using symmetry, that's going to be best. You'll notice that that sketch was not fully defined, um, because I didn't fully define my spline. Again, this is not going to be an exact science, more so a video detailing how we can start creating some of this geometry and start working on our surfboard. So for this one, I'm actually just going to try and define it with 3 points, and that's going to give me most of the geometry that I need. Now, this is very important. Your sketches, they are going to need to have the same vertical constraint on those points. If that vertical constraint doesn't exist, you're going to find some errors because we're going to project some lines to create some 3D curves in just a second. So we are going to need to have that constraint instituted. If you find yourself wanting to change this geometry a little bit more, feel free to add another spline control point to your Bezier, and that can, let's just do it, and you can see how you do that. So I can add another spline point here, and that's going to give me a new area of control. That's still a pretty nice curve, so we don't really have to worry too much. That looks pretty good to me. Cool. Now we want to do a second Bezier curve that is going to define the bottom of the board as well. We've been using 4 points. Let's just stick to the 4 points that we're using. And again, we're now going to want to define the kind of belly of the board, using the Bezier splines that we've put in place. So this one I actually think might be better with the 4 points. Again, not an exact science. I'm just going to leave it here. Try not to over constrain things. It's easy for these lines to start snapping on top of each other. There's a few things going on in the sketch. So, if you go in here and you touch that line or you create a constraint there, you might find that this point doesn't want to move as you expect it to. Just try not to over constrain your sketches, unless that's what you're looking to do. That's pretty much all I need in these two. Now what we're going to do is start creating the 3D curves that are going to help us generate the general outline of the board. So to do that, we're actually going to use a projected curve, and then I can select the outer sketch of my board and then this curve. And if you have constrained everything properly, which you should have done by creating that vertical constraint across the points, you will see that a 3D curve is now created. We'll do that again, and we're just gonna re-show our sketches. I was doing a good job about naming things earlier. So projected curve, select our 2 lines, and that's all we need. Now we have the beginnings of the exterior of our board, and that's really going to help us down the line. So at this point, we can hide or reference images. We're not going to need those anymore. You can also look at these sketches. Don't worry too much about the geometry here. We're going to have the ability to really manipulate it and change it later. So don't worry too much if you're not fully satisfied with the shape now. It's going to become a lot easier for us to change that later down the line. Let's see, there we go. Okay. So now we have our 4 curves. We've just mirrored it. As we talked about earlier, it's going to be easier to work with symmetry. If we stop having symmetry along our design, it will come back to bite us later. So we want to try and use as much symmetry as possible. Now, I want to keep this as kind of informational for you, and so I am going to keep using some techniques to help you design. I will not use all of the very best practices on this video, rather give you a very flexible approach to your design here. And I will do a follow-up video where we take a different approach to the same board, and learn how to do this in a different way. But this method of this workflow is really going to give you a very flexible design environment that's going to let you play around with your product a lot. So we'll call this front. Actually, let's not confuse ourselves. Maybe Okay, and then so we're now going to create a plane in the middle of the board, and we're going to create a second plane that is facing the back of the board. Now, these are going to be very useful for us because we're going to create geometry that covers these 3D curves and this defines the shape that the board's going to have. So I will call this back to plane. Those names are probably not the very best names you could give your planes, but I think you get the point, right? So we have those planes right there. One very easy thing that you can do if you want more control over the general geometry of the board that you're designing is just add more planes, add more sketches, define things a little bit better. That's really going to help you create something that is more filled out in terms of how you're defining the geometry. For today, in this tutorial, I want to give you something quick so that you can just get started. And then I'm going to give you the tools to really play around with this. So now I'm also going to select the Bezier curve and make a tip. And this is going to be important because this is how I'm going to be lofting some of the geometry. And I'm going to make that tangent. And then I'm going to do the same with the bottom curve and this tip. And I'm going to make that tangent. Now, you can make that, again, as big or as small as you want. That will eventually define the outer ridge of your board. We're also going to travel all the way back to the back of the board, and we're going to do a little bit of the same. This is going to take 4 points, and now we're going to have the back of the board. Again, let's add some tangency across these lines. See, this is what I was talking about. I actually had a constraint be instituted here that I don't want. And that is going to over-constrain my sketch if I then try to make that tangent, which is why you saw that error a second ago. So we want to try and avoid that when we can. Sometimes constraints just appear when we don't expect them to. A really easy trick to see what constraints might be there and troubleshoot some of that stuff is just show your constraints in the sketch, and that's going to give you all of the constraints. So you can see that the tangent constraint is here. I can very quickly tap into that and see, see what those constraints look like. So that's just a quick tip. If you didn't know you could see your constraints, you certainly can. So that's a lot of what we need. Right now, the only thing missing for us is actually having the general outline and geometry of the board. So we want to do that, and we want to define it in these two sketches that we put together. For clarity, I'm just going to hide some of the general geometry that we have here, just so that you are not overwhelmed with stuff. So, and then I guess I can hide this mirror as well. So now on this front tip playing, I'm going to start defining some of the geometries that I will be using on the exterior of the board. I like to start with these outside ridges of the board where we can just select the point, select the curve, and we will add a piercing constraint. And we will do the same on these two, and we will add a piercing constraint, right? And so that looks a bit weird, but what we're actually doing is because we already have this 3D curve, well, things might look a little bit weird from certain perspectives, but that's okay. Once you really understand how you're drafting that curve, it becomes simple to start just looking at it and knowing where you're putting those constraints. So I'm going to add another Bezier curve here and some piercing constraints on the other side. I'm going to do this a few times, so if you didn't follow along in that one, I'm sure you'll catch on as we go through. So now I'm also going to add a vertical constraint with this point. As we talked about earlier, that symmetry is going to be really important. We want to keep that through our design as much as possible. You can start with some weird geometry if you want as you start creating these curves as well. It doesn't really matter. You're going to constrain them. And once you constrain them, they're going to start looking proper. So that's simple enough. And actually, this one I'm not going to make because we're going to make a mirrored copy of the first one that we made. And that's just going to give us a better output because symmetry, because we've been talking about symmetry. And then I'm going to create that vertical constraint here on that point. And then I'm going to add that piercing constraint once more on that line. Now, as before, I want to create some tangency through these lines so that my board flows a little bit better. And now you'll see that all of these are starting to be connected. And so we can start moving everything really drastically if we're not careful. So I recommend you just make sure you are not over constraining your board. You can add dimensions to it if you want. So if you actually wanted to start defining how big something is in a more hard coded way, you certainly can. I don't want to do that in this tutorial today because by doing that, you kind of limit the shapes that you're going to be able to explore down the line. Um, it's certainly good practice to fully constrain something, but we don't need to do that today. And then once again, I'm going to use the right plane and I'm going to mirror that curve that we created, and that's going to give us some nice symmetry. Excellent. So that's the first kind of outer shape that we need to put in place. We're also going to build the back shape, and we're practically going to be doing the same thing. I'm just going to get working on this and put all of my ducks in a row. I'll do it a little bit faster this time so that we can move on to the next part. So again, just some piercing constraints on those curves. As you can see, I'm not worried about matching the geometry perfectly. I simply want to get the geometries aligned and with the right number of control points, because that's what fundamentally will end up driving a lot of the work that I'm going to be doing. So that's all I needed to start defining this second sketch, which is at the back of our surfboard. We can also manipulate these curves now, and we're just going to close things up by mirroring around the right sketch one more time. So now you can see that the general geometry is defined, and we have both of these kind of like outline shapes. So let's go back and look at what we've defined so far, right? So if we actually look through the geometries that we've built, we've created most of the skeleton for what will become our surfboard. And from here, things get relatively simpler because now we're just going to create the surfaces that will define this body. And by doing that, we then give ourselves the platform to explore and figure out how we want to change those shapes to make them look how we want them to look. So I'm going to be using some simpler tools today in the way that I surface this. I will do another video down the line that will use some more complicated tools. So we're going to use fill. Fill is extremely useful. We're going to be able to just fill the space between a set of curves. You just have to select something that's a closed loop of some type, and then or some type of closed boundary region, and then you can define some constraints. Now, let's show the ISO guide. So just so you understand a little bit of what's going on, we're basically laying out this big set of lines, and that's defining that shape. And then that's also going to get trimmed to the shape that we're specifying on the boundary. So that's more or less how the trim is working. We're not going to be too worried about the ISO guides, but that's a good tool to start analyzing how the curvature works. Then we're going to select some guides. So these guides are just going to be those curves that we were setting in place earlier. And that's going to help us just create that curvature for the board. So you can see that as we establish these, that's going to give us that little bit of curvature that we would expect out of our surfboard, right? We don't want it being totally flat. We want to start having some of that nice curve appeal. So that's one of the two main surfaces that we need. Let's do that again, but this time we're going to do it in the bottom surface. We are going to need both of those sketches. So here you'll see a better example of how fill is creating the general geometry, but I actually selected the wrong fill area. So it's creating the general geometry, but it's not giving me that curve that I want at the bottom. So I'm going to establish some guides and just fill across those guides. And that's going to start really shaping my board properly. So quite easily, I've created both the top and bottom of my board. Nice. So from here, we're going to use another very powerful tool in our surfacing arsenal, which is the loft tool. So you'll find loft next to some of the other solid body modeling tools. And today we're going to be using the surface option. And you can either create a new surface and then boolean it, or you can just add the surface right onto the design that we're putting together right here. So as we create a loft, we're going to want to select some profiles for the loft, and that's going to be, in this scenario, the top of my board and the bottom of my board. That's it. Now, what you'll notice is that, well, that's kind of sandwiching both things together, but it's not creating the right curvature that I was looking for, and I spent some good time defining with those sketches and Bezier splines that we were using earlier. So the way that we would tackle that problem is by creating some guides. By guiding that loft, we're going to be able to say, hey, look, I actually want you to start here at the tip. And then as you travel down the spine of the board, we're going to be using these other pieces of geometry to define the general outline of that board. And very quickly, you can start to see that this board is coming to life, right? And that's looking more like a surfboard. Again, the ISO lines here, you can see that it's laying out control points across the length of the loft, and that's going to be how we are generating our surface. There's a lot that you can do with the loft tool. There's a lot of options here, from like matching end conditions. You can do a lot of really interesting work. We're not going to worry about it too much today. Again, I just want to give you a good platform so that you can start designing your surfboard, playing around with the product, and actually seeing how some of these surfacing tools can come to life. So that's most of the surfboard. Now we just have to close up the second part. Maybe your first thought was, I'll just do another loft. But once again, we really want to try and use that symmetry. Symmetry is our friend when we're surfacing. So we're just going to do a feature mirror. Then we're going to select the loft that we just put together, and then we're going to mirror it around the right sketch. And that's going to create a part. So let's take a second to observe what happened here. Right now I have surface 1, and that is defining my surfboard. But the moment that I select the right plane, that actually becomes a part. And that's because in Onshape, whenever you fully close a body and you make it watertight, that becomes a part. So just keep that in mind. Once we fully define a surface, it's going to become a part. Now we can take that part and say, hey, this is my board. And you can go ahead and do some things like edit its appearance. Maybe we want a white surfboard. I always find that white surfboards are more appealing to me. And then from here, well, you can do things like add an appearance to a face. Maybe you want some type of belly color, and we can also add some decals to it. So if you want to do some more customization of the board and you wanted to do some quick decals, this is pretty straightforward to do now that we've defined our main geometry. So let's say this is 5, and then we're not really constraining things too much. We're just letting things happen and giving ourselves some flexibility. And then I need some lettering. Why not? We will call this, whoops, shape. Excellent. So now I've created some nice decal work. 200, that might still be too big. 150. Okay, that looks about reasonable. And we're gonna transform our lettering just because that's not gonna fit on our board as is. So let's put our Onshape logo on our surfboard. That might still be too big. Let's make it 100 centimeters. Excellent. And then we can just put it right on our surfboard. So that's our sketch. Now what we can do is we can actually split this face, and we're going to split it with that sketch which is defined. And just like that, we have now created some logos. And again, just we're customizing a surfboard today. We're also going to split this face, and that's going to give us like a nice ridge there to put some aesthetics on it. So what we can do, if you want to just really honing on adding some flavor to your board, is you can actually add some customization and just kind of make it your own. That's what we're all here for, is customizing our own surfboard, uh, starting that summer season right. So pretty quickly, you can see that my board is coming to life. Now, maybe you're looking at this and saying, hey, I'm not totally satisfied with some of the shapes that are put in place here. And I want to start editing my geometry and figuring out how I can really optimize my design. Actually, before we get into that, you might notice there's a super sharp corner here. This would be a good thing to just throw a quick fillet on. Doing there's definitely better approaches to this as well. This is going to be a pretty tight fillet, so doing a good loft and figuring out how to really clean up that edge is going to be part of that next video where we talk about some more advanced surfacing techniques. But before we do that, we're going to build the thing and we're going to build some other cool parts. Anyways, back to how do we change this geometry, right? So let's look at this top sketch that actually defines most of what our board is about. And let's just press that final button. So what that final button does, it actually helps us visualize. If I now make a change here and I actually make my board more slimmed down, I can actually press final and it's going to show me how that's going to ripple through my entire design process and how that is going to be part of my design later down the line. So very quickly, I can start redefining the way that this board is shaped. Sometimes it will break because you're going really far in a direction that it's not expecting. But it's easy enough to bring it back and start just manipulating it back into a shape that it likes. So this gives you a really good tool to start exploring your design and figuring out how you want to make it work. What you will notice right here is that it's breaking because I didn't fully define that Bezier spline that we were talking about earlier. So if I had fully defined that, I could probably give it a little bit more flexibility, but it's probably flipping the Bezier spline and that's taking my corner out. But that's why the final button is very helpful, because I can really analyze those things and think, hey, how do I want to change this? And maybe something's going to break, maybe it's not, but it gives you the flexibility to make those decisions without having to always commit that feature and figuring out if it's going to break or not. You're also going to be able to do that across this sketch. So, if you wanted something that's a little bit thicker or a little bit thinner, that's going to be fairly straightforward to do. You can just manipulate it and you'll see that your board just suddenly changed shape pretty radically. So that's most of what I had for you today. I hope that this was a fun tutorial on how to customize your own surfboard. Please let us know in the comments what you thought about this. Did I go too fast? Did I go too slow? What else would you like to see? And we would love to hear your thoughts and keep building some great tutorials alongside our user base. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you at the next one.